Welcome to Tell Me About East Asia, a podcast by the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Arizona. The Center for East Asian Studies is a Title VI National Resource Center supported by the U.S. Department of Education. The center supports and promotes teaching and research related to East Asian languages and studies throughout the university, and it cultivates an understanding of East Asia through outreach to K-12 schools, undergraduate institutions, and wider communities. Today, we'd like to welcome Dr. Kimberly Hassel to the podcast. Welcome, Dr. Hassel. I thought we could start by having you tell us just a little bit about yourself. How did you get interested in Japanese studies?
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Gregory, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here on this podcast. I must confess, I've wanted to be on a podcast for so long, and during the pandemic, I wanted to start my own podcast, much like many other people, the equivalent of let's start a band. We should start a band. So, thank you so much for having me.
We all end up on a podcast eventually, I think. That's right.
Great. So, in terms of how I got interested in Japanese studies, so my origin story, it doesn't start off in an archive. It actually started off with my childhood. Like many other millennials, I was very interested in Japanese popular culture. I would wake up every Saturday morning to watch Pokemon and Digimon. When students ask me this question, I actually show them a photo of my first exposure to Japan, which was a Hello Kitty phone, which some of my students actually remembered and have. So needless to say, it started off with an interest in pop culture. And in 2008, I went to Japan for the first time. I was in middle school. My mom kindly was saving up money to bring my twin sister and me to Japan. So, and I'll always be grateful for her for that, because that jump-started my academic interest and deeper interest in Japan. So I went to Tokyo and as a young kid, and I realized, wow, there is way more to Japan than pop culture and anime, which now I kind of cringe at the thought. As a young kid, I was like, Japan equals Pikachu equals pop culture. But I'm really grateful for that trip, because it really exposed me to other parts of Japan. And so when I entered college, I started learning Japanese, and I went to study abroad in Japan. I began taking courses in Japanese society and culture and literature. And that's when I just started developing research interests and also interest in teaching. I went to Japan each year in undergrad to teach English at a university, to do my own independent research projects. And I eventually wrote an honors thesis about the Japanese school uniform. And once I graduated, I was like, wait, so many more questions. Then I ended up getting a PhD. So I started at Princeton, continued my study, and that also jump-started my interest in youth culture, digital culture, and identity from an anthropological and ethnographic standpoint. And here I am today.
Here you are. And so you were trained as an anthropologist. What do you feel is the anthropological approach to these kind of things in Japan?
Right, that's an excellent question. So I started off actually in media studies, and then slowly made my way into anthropology. But in terms of the anthropological approach, in terms of my methodology as a digital ethnographer and a cultural anthropologist, I interact with people one-on-one in person and do participant observation. So as the term suggests, that's both participating in and observing a phenomenon or a dynamic. So I talk to young people about their use of social media and smartphones. I watch them use their smartphones and social media. And I also just do media analysis. So that's where the digital ethnography also comes in. I look at Twitter hashtags, Instagram hashtags, see what's trending, do some analysis there. So I guess my methodology is really this combination of online ethnography, digital ethnography, and then in-person interactions with my interlocutors.
And how long have you been at the University of Arizona?
What week are we in now? 12 weeks. So this is week 12. So it's my first semester here at the University of Arizona, and I'm just so excited to be here. It still feels so surreal.
Well, as your colleague from a couple doors down, I think I already knew that, but I had to ask anyway. So welcome to the University of Arizona.
Thank you so
I was
much.
wondering if you could say something about what kind of classes you teach.
Right. So this semester I'm teaching a general education course on Japanese popular culture. It's called Japanese Popular Culture, Anime, Manga, and so much more. That class has 170 students, which really
Wow.
speaks to the popularity of Japanese pop culture, especially amongst Gen Z. So in that class, we talk about media mix, which is a theory of basically transmedia storytelling and franchising. So we talk about basically how pop culture is present everywhere. So from department stores, from anime, from video games, toys. We had a whole week on toys, and students brought in toys related to pop culture. So I brought a whole Beyblade arena, which I had not seen in years. And then we also think about anime as a lens into dynamics and issues within contemporary Japanese society. So we watch films like Ghost in the Shell and think about cyborgs and tech in society. We watch Princess Mononoke and think about environmentalism and indigeneity. We just watched Your Name, Kimi no Nawa, and we spoke about precarity, disaster, and recovery. So that's basically the second part of the course. And the last part of the course, we talk about globalization and transnational fan culture. So, and that topic really resonates with my students. Some students talk about how their first exposure to Japanese pop culture was Bad Bunny and his Yonaguni music videos, or Megan Thee Stallion, who's a huge fan of anime. So we really highlight these kind of contemporary fan cultures. And so that's the course and the 3 points that we learned in the class that students, I think they kind of come in and really don't think about this, but one, that Japan is not unique or weird. There's some students who come in with that idea. We also emphasize how the US or the West, scare quotes, is not the universal standard. And also there's more to Japan than anime and pop culture. So we really learn about the anthropological aspects. So that's one course. The other course that I teach is an upper level undergrad and joint grad seminar called Anthropology Japan, Images and Realities. And we think about the history of Japan anthropology. We look at ethnographic representations of issues in contemporary Japan. And we also think about the future of Japan anthropology. So what can and should the future of the field look like? So those are my current courses. Next semester, I'm teaching the pop culture class again, and I'm teaching a class called Megacity Tokyo, which is about everyday life in Tokyo, history, digital. And in terms of future courses, I'm proposing a course on critical digital studies in and of Japan, and also a course on Afro-Asia.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I love how you use these popular culture, Japanese popular culture topics to bring students to a deeper understanding of some of the anthropological principles that are going on in society. So, Dr. Hassel, this podcast is called Tell Me About East Asia. So every episode we'll be asking our guests to tell me about their area of expertise. And with you, it's social media in Japan. So tell me about social media in Japan. What do I need to know?
Many things. But there are just so many interesting themes and topics to address related to social media. But I'll start off by saying that, although social media and smartphones are perceived to be ubiquitous, these technologies are localized within a particular historical and societal context. So context matters, and that is one of my main research questions or themes. So with regards to social media in Japan, I think one really interesting historical moment or thing to consider is that Japan has been this pioneer in mobile communications, starting in the 90s, or even way before if we think about pagers. But so Japan has offered mobile internet beginning in the 90s and 1999, or as my students say, the late 1900s. But with the release of iMode, and this was kind of a mobile internet function released by NTT Docomo, which is one of the mobile retailers in Japan. And so this is an important moment because in the 90s, in other places like the United States, the internet was primarily being accessed through computers. So
Right.
mobile internet has been around in Japan for a while, and Japan has been a pioneer in that regard. With regards to, so with my research, I'm interested in the shift from keitai and garakes, or these flip phones, feature phones, and then kind of the heightened functions of smartphones, including software, so social media or social networking services, as is the localized term in Japan. In terms of major platforms that are popular, Line is perhaps the most popular platform in Japan. It's what Mark Steinberg calls a super app. So it's everything. It's
Yes.
you could do Wi-Fi calling, video call. You could do stamps, which are these like stickers that you could use.
Their stamps are excellent, by the way.
Excellent, yes. One of my favorite parts of Line. There's also a news function, a wallet, games, and Line was very important during the pandemic, which I'll get to later on, because it was the primary means of staying in touch with others. And Line is just so popular that government entities were actually partnering up with Line to distribute a survey to see people's symptoms, and also even made a guidebook on how to navigate the pandemic through the use of Line. Sometimes it's involved like online drinking parties using the video calls, or just ordering food through Line. So really interesting things going on with Line. Other apps that are popular, YouTube, very, very popular. In fact, there's a survey distributed amongst kids, and many kids want to become YouTubers when they grow up. It's actually very lucrative. There's also Twitter, which is very popular, and anonymous accounts are actually very prevalent on Twitter, and the percentage is quite high vis-a-vis places such as the US. Then finally, there's Instagram, and Instagram is one of my platforms of interest. I'm very interested in Instabae or Instagenic culture. So those are kind of the primary platforms that I look into. Of course, there are many more. So those, if you're interested in social media in particular, which platforms are popular, those are the ones to start off with.
That's fascinating. I'm curious, other than Line, most of those platforms are widely used in the United States and around the world. I feel like initially, wasn't there some resistance to platforms like Twitter and even YouTube in Japan? They always seem to have their own local equivalent of some of these things.
Right.
What was it called? Mixer or something like that?
There's Mixi, which is
Mixi,
the blogging platform, which was very popular. Now I think some people still use it. But yeah, it's interesting that at first there's this resistance, or it's not as popular, but over time they actually grow in popularity, and
Right.
they become localized in their own way. And that's actually kind of a point that I make in my research. Again, like how seemingly ubiquitous or universal platforms
Yes.
become localized and have their own narrations. So young people have very specific narrations of how each platform works, and or the roles of these platforms in their everyday lives. And sometimes they differ from, say, when I talk to my students here at UA about these platforms, there's some nuances in the narration. So again, localization matters. And sometimes there are similarities in the way these platforms are used, and that's actually kind of another provocation that I make in my research. There are similarities, and I think it's important that we highlight social media use in contexts that aren't the US, aren't Silicon Valley, aren't
Yes.
Australia or the UK. There's a lot of literature coming out from there, but we don't see representation of Japan, which is interesting given the fact that Japan has been this pioneer and that the iMode was actually the inspiration for iOS and Android. So,
Oh, really?
yeah.
I am actually old enough to remember iMode. I lived in Japan at the time, and I remember it was like using the internet, but it wasn't a full-fledged browser, right? Like it wasn't with, I don't think it had a lot of images and things like that, right? It was more of a static, and it was on a flip phone with a tiny screen, right? And if I remember, wasn't iMode like supported by the development of that technology? Wasn't it supported by the Japanese government or something like that?
Right. It was basically very domestic. So
Yes.
when we think of the term like garake, which is what people say for flip phones or feature phones, the linguistic nuance of Galapagos plus keitai, which is mobile phone, really hints at this technology that developed in Japan and had such a hold in terms of telecommunications that Japan actually didn't really feel a need to kind of import other telecommunications. So yeah.
I remember when the iPhone first came out, there was all of this discourse about how Japan would never adopt the iPhone because they have iMode and they have their own technologies, and this kind of, I love that metaphor, Galapagos, right? But that seems to have crumbled a little bit, right?
Right. Scott, something interesting or fun that you might want to know is that there's a museum in Tokyo, in Ryogoku, that NTT Docomo has, and you see the cell phones, the garage behind glass. And when I present images of garage and flip phones in a museum, you just kind of see people gasping or you hear the gasp in the crowds, like, flip phones in museums? Feels like it was just yesterday.
Right. Yeah, you might see my old keitai in the. I think I threw it out a few years ago. I held on to it for a while, but never did. Anyway, that's fascinating. I see that you've published quite a bit in the last really the last year or so, on related topics. You want to talk about that? I saw that you have an article called "Digital Sociality in COVID-19 Japan." So how did you end up researching the effects of COVID on the digital world? I guess we all researched in a way during lockdown.
Yep. It definitely became part of our lives. So that article, well, just speaking about that research, so I was in Japan doing my dissertation fieldwork beginning in August 2019, and the project was about the relationship between social networking services, smartphone ownership, and digital sociality in Japan, and how that impacts notions of being social and also notions of the self among young people. So I was doing this project before COVID. I was in Japan, and then the pandemic happened. While I was there doing my fieldwork on digital tech and the relationship with digital tech and sociality.
In a way, perfect timing, right?
It definitely really impacted my research and became its own chapter in the dissertation, needless to say. But yeah, with
making lemonade out of lemons, I guess, right?
Yeah, it perhaps my way of coping with what was going on, but I just could not avoid talking about COVID because it definitely impacted the lives of my interlocutors and my research. And what ended up happening, and this is what I talk about in that article, is that prior to the pandemic, when I was interviewing young people about the roles of social media and smartphone use in their lives, many of them emphasized how important it was, like practically speaking, in terms of, for example, checking train schedules, accessing like news or alarms related to earthquakes, or just meeting up with friends. So like practically speaking, it was useful and also great for entertainment. But young people emphasize that these technologies are useful tools, so emphasis on tools that should supplement in-person sociality but should never replace it. Now, the pandemic happened.
Right.
That resulted in a complete shift of thinking, and the young people whom I interviewed really began to rethink what these technologies meant in their everyday lives, and also what they were taking for granted in terms of sociality and also these technologies. So the article talks about that, and it also talks about the ethics of doing digital ethnography. So because of the pandemic and because interviewing people in person and hanging out with them would be a danger to their health and to my own health,
Right.
I did complete remote fieldwork, even though I was in Japan, so lots of Zoom interviews. And there's an ethics to that. So I talk about that and talk about what we could learn from that and also what can be gained from digital ethnography.
That's fascinating. Was there, just out of curiosity, what was the discourse about work from home in Japan? Was it similar to what happened in the States? Was there resistance or?
Well, there was a lot of confusion because prior to the pandemic, there wasn't really infrastructure for
Right.
working from home and also remote learning. So the pandemic was the first time that a lot of universities or schools were using video kind of recordings or in terms of like Zoom or Skype. So there was mostly a scramble in figuring out how to incorporate that into lesson plans and on a kind of a government scale, but also just infrastructure. Electronic signatures, that was something that became a topic of interest because previously you would go with your hanko, with your stamp and, stamp documents, but the pandemic happened, so
Right.
there was more discourse on adopting electronic signatures and really boosting infrastructure with regard to digitalization.
So there was a lot going on while you were there.
Definitely, yes.
I also wanted to ask you about, you have a chapter in an edited volume coming out. The edited volume is Who is the Asianist? The Politics of Representation in Asian Studies. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. So that also came about through my dissertation research. And so during my fieldwork, I experienced a lot of significant moments, just historically and also in terms of social issues. So the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations of the summer of 2020 also coincided with my research. So I study social media and smartphone use in Japan, but another one of my research interests is critical mixed race studies and Afro-Japanese encounters. So this has also always been something that I also investigate or examine in my research. But with regards to this article or this chapter in the edited volume, I basically talk about how Black Japanese users of social media use storytelling as a way to intervene in kind of the discourse that was going on that BLM and issues of anti-Blackness and police brutality these are issues that don't pertain to Japan because there is no racism in Japan. That is a discourse that was happening. So Black Japanese users of social media went to Instagram, went to Twitter to share their own experiences and stories of anti-Black racism. And you see that in the anecdotes of celebrities such as Naomi Osaka and also Louis Okoye, but you also see it in kind of for example, my interlocutors. I talk about Grace and Joel and how they both used Instagram to really spread awareness about BLM and really talk about their own experiences. I also talk about an influencer named Coco Lizzie. So I basically talk about the role of social media in activism, and this is part of kind of a larger chapter in my book about activism after the triple disaster of March 11, 2011. And in that chapter, the edited volume, I also talk more broadly about positionality and fieldwork, drawing upon my own positionality as a scholar of intersecting identities, as someone who's Dominican American, mixed, Black woman. So I talk about that and what we can do in Asian studies in terms of training.
Maybe I should mention the title of the chapter is Black Japanese Storytelling as Praxis, Anti-Racist Digital Activism and Black Lives Matter in Japan. I was wondering, could you tell us how you define Black Japanese?
Sure. In the context of this chapter, the interlocutors there, they identify as Black and Japanese, so they have a Black parent and a Japanese parent. So in the context of the chapter, that's how I define it. Of course, there's like a wide spectrum to this identity. So.
And we're talking about your interlocutors live in Japan.
Yes, my interlocutors live in Japan. Some of the celebrities that I speak about, so namely Naomi Osaka, they do not live in Japan, but the people I interviewed or spoke with for this chapter, they are living in Japan.
So this is a very broad category that you...
Yes.
And finally, you have another article
Yes.
called Digitizing Women's World's Gendered Spheres of Sociality, Visual Participatory Culture, and Media Remix in 5G Japan. Do you want to tell us about that one?
Yes. So revisions are still happening, but
You'll get there.
Well, I'll get there. So yes, this article is about the intersections between consumerism and visual participatory culture, especially amongst girls and young women in Japan. So I'm interested in basically how new, quote, forms of visual participatory culture actually build upon older forms of participatory culture. So I draw connections, for example, between Instabae or Instagenic culture and...
Do you want to spell that? So
yes, INSTABAE.
Right.
Instabae, yeah. So connection between Instabae culture and Purikuda culture, or like photo booth culture.
Photo booth, right.
Yep. And also connections between, for example, contemporary photogenic travel campaigns, so Tabijeni, which is by the Nippon Travel Agency.
Oh.
It might be a bit of a niche campaign that maybe I was just in one of those rabbit holes on the internet and found the Tabijeni campaign. But this is a campaign that highlights going to spots that are perfect for taking photos for your social media. They're photogenic. So drawing connections between that and Dentsu's Discover Japan campaign. So lots of repetition going on here and interesting connections. So I talk about how social media and visual participatory culture is central to play and sociality amongst girls and young women. But I also talk about the nuances. So for example, the question of are young women being exploited by corporations because they're perhaps unknowingly providing labor for these corporations.
Right.
And also the question of online representation versus how spaces appear in person or offline. So a lot of my interlocutors would comment on finding this place on Instagram and thinking it's shiny, so it's Instabae, and then they go in person and they're like, this is it? What? And then there's massive lines of people and you have to wait in line just to kind of take a photo of this one thing. So this dissonance between online representation and offline ontology is something that I talk about too.
Right, that's fascinating. So is this all part of a larger project? Is there a book in the works?
Yes, there is a book in the works.
Excellent.
And I'm really excited about this project. So the book, it's based on kind of the past fieldwork that I've done, and also will be based on ongoing fieldwork that I'm doing and will do this summer. But it basically talks about how can the digital serve as a lens in observing change and continuity in Japan, especially with regards to gender and identity. So I talk about, again, social media and smartphone use just historically, and also contextualizing them in these larger moments. So, for example, the 90s with iMode, and then the triple disaster of March 11, 2011, which really jump-started digital activism, and the Reiwa era, so this, the start of the Reiwa era, and then the COVID-19 pandemic. So lots of major events that I talk about in the book. And then I talk about how narrations and imaginations and perceptions of the centrality of the digital and everyday life, how that shifts. And each chapter of the book talks about what social media and smartphones, what they mean for various users, so ranging from schoolgirls to Black Japanese activists. So that's in the works. And of course, COVID is a huge part of the book as well. And I'm hoping to also include a discussion of what the digital also means for kind of broader Japanese pop culture. And I've been very interested in this topic ever since, teaching my pop culture class, because my students talk about how TikTok, which I should mention is also a huge platform that I look at in my research. But my students talk about how TikTok really led to this resurgence in interest in Japanese pop culture and anime, and how the pandemic, many of them postulate, really led to an increase in interest in anime, and also less of a stigma with watching anime and being a fan of anime.
There was a stigma before?
Well, yeah, I mean, speaking from just like observations from when I was growing up, there's definitely a stigma. If you were a huge anime fan or an otaku, you would get bullied. I would see it happen, and but now it's just, anime is just a huge part of Gen Z culture.
It's the mainstream, right?
It's the mainstream now. So I've been noticing, and some students talk about this, just the huge role that TikTok and social media has played in this. So I'm thinking that might be an epilogue to the book, or maybe the start of another project or an article. But
sounds great. Sounds great and very timely. Well, we'll all look forward to reading the book. And thanks so much for your time today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.